When Peter D'Adamo and I recorded our interview, it was like a couple of old biddies or guys standing at the bar. We just went on for an extraordinary amount of time. It was originally scheduled for 45 minutes. We went for almost an hour and a half. And because of that, when I edited the Breathing Forward story for Lung Transplant Awareness Week, there was obviously a lot of material that was left over. So because of that, I decided to publish this special additional excerpt, which actually covers Peter and I talking about a whole host of things, some related to our relative lung disease, but actually a lot more of it was about philosophy, about medicine, and about the advances there, and just about everything. So please enjoy what I've entitled Peter's Extra Bits. I've already completed an interview about 50 minutes with Jenny McFarlane. I came across Jenny because when I was trying to research and find out about this lung transplant thing, because obviously it came on me very quickly. Like, you know, I thought I was going to get better from my collapse, that I didn't. And I was in a medical ICU and they said, yeah, we're listening to you for transplant. And that was it. And nobody had discussed transplant in any serious context before that moment. Whereas Jenny had lived with cystic fibrosis since an infant and had always known that that was going to be her destination. But she created a podcast and she's got about 150 odd sessions that she's recorded, all related to solid organ transplant. So it's not exclusively lung transplant, but there's a large proportion of lung transplant because that's her story. And she interviewed me sort of like about 6 months post-transplant. And I gave her my story. And the episode is called When You're Going Through Hell, which is from the country song about when you're going through hell, keep on going. And so from that perspective, that was kind of the theme of my story. But Jenny is very, very interesting because she started a foundation. She had very humble background. She's married to an ER nurse, male nurse. And, you know, from her perspective, I just wanted to return the favor to Jenny. And she was very gracious and came on. And it was kind of fascinating because, again, we focused on her story. The other person I'm interviewing is a guy that I actually worked with back at Allscripts. And for a very brief period, like 6 weeks, he was my boss. And so I got to know him a little bit then. And then I kind of stayed kind of casually in contact as an acquaintance, professional acquaintance through the next kind of sort of like maybe 10 years. But hadn't really any real connection with him, bumped into him at conferences a couple of times, but that was it. After I had put out about my story on LinkedIn and shared that I had had a lung transplant, he reached out to me and said, can we talk? And I was like, sure. And so set up a call. Suddenly he tells me his brother has advanced IPF and he does. His brother is petrified about having a lung transplant. And because of that, he's petrified about it. But they know a lot because they are, you know, sort of monozygotal twins. Right?
Wow.
And they both fell off a cliff with their disease process at the same time. Subsequently, they've both had a lung transplant in the last year. And so they both had double lungs and they are both doing exceptionally well in their recovery. But they had already been diagnosed with short telomere. So they put that down to that. And it's so weird that the clock ran out on both of them genetically at the same time because they obviously had lived, you know, environmentally different lives after being teenagers. So very, very interesting that at a cellular level. And I hope Mayo Jacksonville, which is where his brother was being cared for, and Duke, which is where Dean is being cared for, are somehow cooperating in terms of, you know, what's the linkage here? Because, you know, I think that you probably appreciate that's an incredibly rich set of data to play around with in terms of at a cellular genetic level, what's going on with IPF in that setting.
I worked
So
with a
I'm
guy named,
interviewing Dean about that.
I worked at Brigham with a Benjamin Raby because of the connection to my father having IPF and passing away from it. So they did the standard, well, they did the telomere studies, but they also did a extensive um, genetic analysis for the major components that have been associated with IPF. But most of them have, it's kind of a incestuous relationship because they
Mm,
do studies on the telomeres, and then the genes they look at have to do with telomeres. So they're
yeah,
not really looking at genetic factors that are independent of telomeres, which I think would be
yeah,
more interesting.
yeah.
But anyway, I have what's called a PARN variant, PARN, and I have a heterozygous mutation there. And the wonderful hemonc that had grown so friendly with said, let's look up this thing and see what the story was. So they went to the Nomad database and said, what's the odds of this? And he came back. He said 1 in 800,000. He said have this.
Mm,
But again, it's only one part of there's a whole thing, Turk and a whole bunch of other genes that plug into this to make the telomere structure. And really nobody knows what the impact is. I mean, according to everyone who's ever heard about me and my telomeres, I should have been white when I was, you know, 35 years old. Now, if I
mm,
was to grow my beard out, 50% of it would still be dark, and I'm approaching 70.
yep,
So again, a lot of this is, not causal.
yeah.
It's something else. It's something different. But
I
I like to see people being interested in it. There's an interesting thing. I just read a study that um, came out yesterday on how disruptions in circadian rhythms are now linked to fibrotic diseases, things like sleep disturbances.
mm,
So, again, we're going back to looking at fundamentals, your intestinal health.
yep.
They think there's a link between that and what are called inflammasomes, which are these parts of the immune system that sort of get ramped up and stay ramped up. So he puts you in a kind of a pro-inflammatory state all the time. But anyway, the uh,
Well,
the bottom line,
inflammation. Yeah, inflammation is weird because again throughout my adult life, I mean, I was big, probably obese, even as a late teenager. And I obviously, as an early adult, I kind of like try to stay reasonably fit. But there are pictures of me with my kids as young infants, preschool, and I am round faced. I mean, like I look back at it now and I go, holy moly, what was I thinking? Well, I was just living life. I was just getting on. I was physically able to do things. But I had that obesity throughout that. But in my teens, I started developing allergies. And I had some asthma attacks even back then. And I put it down to environmental because first time I came home from nursing school, my mum had got a dog. I don't know if it was because I had left home, but whatever. She suddenly had a dog that we didn't have in the house when I was growing up. Well, I immediately, as soon as I would, stroke the dog, touch my face, suddenly my eyes are like exploding, you know. So from that perspective, I suddenly became aware that that was going on. Didn't connect it to inflammatory process. It was just, hey, it's that allergies. People get those, don't they? So you start taking meds. And so from that perspective, I became aware. But as I got into my 40s, and that's the magic time, the eyes start to go, all the other stuff starts to go, the hair starts to gray. I was delighted about that because I had such a round, baby-faced face. Everybody thought I was much younger than I actually was. So I was delighted when some gray hair started appearing. But I think that I became more and more interested in inflammatory process. And I think that's when, I came across your book or read synopsis. I'll admit I didn't read the whole book. But I started becoming very aware of all of these other triggers to inflammation, and that inflammation was more complex. And ultimately, I was talking to somebody the other day about disease process and said, it's really complicated. We know there's genotypical and phenotypical factors in our body in terms of what's going on with the interplay. And it's a bit like your larder. Between your refrigerator and your larder, you have hundreds and hundreds of ingredients. And you can take a recipe book that says, take these 6 things out of your larder and put them on your kitchen counter. And you can mix them together. And depending how you mix them together, how you treat them, in what order, you can create anything from a meringue to scrambled eggs. And I think that in my simplistic way of explaining to people why it's so complicated to understand is look at that. Take sort of that set of ingredients that you might have. And depending on how they mix together, interact, in what order, what's going on, our bodies are very much like that. It's very, very difficult to say that everybody is going to follow the same path, depending on the mix of things that happen, both from a genetic perspective, phenotypically, how we treat our body, the environment that we're exposed to. All of those things now interplay. And, also as science has advanced, we've learned genes are not set in concrete. They evolve in our bodies, through the cellular replication, and cellular replication is also damaging to, what's going on and how fast that's happening. But I think that explaining to lay people that kind of recipe analogy of take 6 ingredients and just try and sort of think of the many things that you could create out of those 6 ingredients, that gives you some idea that when you then make that millions of variables in the human body, why this can happen to some person and that can happen to someone else. And yet, based on what we know already, it's the same basic building blocks and ingredients that we're actually operating with, but how they're treated.
This is an interesting observation for 2 reasons. You're probably familiar with this because you study systems, but there's what's called the small world phenomenon, which says, it's paraphrased as 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You can get from the actor Kevin Bacon to anyone else in 6 degrees. It turns out that you can produce any molecule from any other molecule by a maximum of 6 reactions. So you can go from something to anything you want in 6 reactions. And the interesting thing about the way that it plays out in terms of our differences, we know there's a thing called epigenetics, which is the non-genetic control of genetic expression. And I had written a book about this way back in 2006, and it was pilloried as being science fiction. Of course, now it's utter reality. And I wasn't even one of the investigators. I was simply reporting on what was being done. And they looked
future casting, Peter, future casting.
All the things that, I intimated at. I even included telomeres as an epigenetic phenomenon in the book. But the thing about this is it really is the link between environment, genetics, and the conveyance between one generation to another of accumulated information about that genomic expression. So, for instance, if you can imagine, our genes have sort of locks on them that are called either methylation groups. These are chemicals that sit at the front of the gene that kind of take the reading frame out or into production. And these methylation, they're like the things you put on your car when you park in the wrong place in New York City. They're like blocks, wheel blocks.
Yep.
These are all done environmentally. And the interesting thing is that they are accumulated in the course of our lives and in the course of our passing the genetic material onto our offspring. It's not as nice as genetic conveyance, but roughly 1 in 200 of these marks will be conveyed to the offspring. So your accumulated environmental experiences as part of the repertoire of what is been memorized as to what you want to do with those genes you have is conveyed onwards. And as you were given that from your progenitors.
If you've been moved by today's stories, please consider becoming an organ donor. In the United States, go to organdonor.gov, and in the UK, organdonation.nhs.uk. Be someone's hero. Yeah. And so I'm going to follow that line through for a second to make it personal. So I was separated from my birth father. I'm the eldest of sort of four children that my mother had. Suddenly, in 2000, I was contacted by his sister, my aunt, to say, um, unfortunately, your dad is dying. He really wants to speak with you.
Hmm.
Would you be willing to me to put you in touch with him? And of course, my reaction was immediately, a human one of course. I mean, if he wants to speak with me, I have no ill feeling towards him. My mother didn't either, as I was growing up. So let's do that. Turns out that he had developed lung cancer. Now, at the time that I found out about this in 2000, I obviously had no, sort of pulmonary symptoms. I took that at face value. He had been a very practical, hands-on man. He had done lots of advanced, what I'll call cabinetry for high-end clients like banks, etc. And obviously, a lot of that is you're working with veneers, you're working with solvents, you're working with manufactured wood products, i.e., MDF and things that produce a lot of dust.
Mm.
So, and he had smoked from his teenage years and not stopped. So therefore, I went, he's passed on at the age of 62 because he has, just basically been exposed to all that stuff.
Sure.
Now, I honestly wish I could go back and find out phenotypical information and even genetic information about him to find out how much of a through line there was, exactly as you're describing. Now go to the other side of that path. My son has very advanced, sort of pancreatic disease that has resulted in, and I think I may have shared this, us moving here to Minnesota for him to have a total pancreectomy because the damage was so extensive. The opinion of his doctors in Nashville was you wake up every morning with a 3-sided dice as to whether you're going to develop cancerous cells. Because of the damage that's there. So you really need to lose this organ to, prolong your life. So he's had that. And the more that we've looked into that, he's got CFTR markers for cystic fibrosis, although never developed any pulmonary symptoms related to cystic fibrosis, but it is implicated in pancreatic disease. He had a pancreatic divisum, so he had a structural failing in terms of the way that the pancreas had formed in utero, which meant that he was basically not producing the enzymes that were being produced for digestion were basically getting blocked up inside his pancreas. So some of the damage and inflammation was related to the enzymes basically trying to eat the pancreas instead of, getting into the digestive system.
That's actually the acute pancreatitis model too.
Correct.
So something comes along your way like a little cork.
Yep.
And cause up the pancreatic duct, and you eat yourself for lunch.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And then the other complicating factor is both Sarah and I, we found out from 23andMe, God bless them, are both carriers of alpha 1, which means that Jamie has ended up as the unusual variant of that. And again, whilst he doesn't necessarily have liver disease and he doesn't necessarily have the lung presentations of the impact of, being, having a misformed alpha 1 response, he has those complications there. And that's what I come back to. It's like that recipe book. It's like, okay, what is the perfect storm of things that caused him to have such severe pancreatic disease? Yes, there was the malformation, which was, genetic, it just malformed in utero. Yes, he's got the CFTR, that's implicated. And yes, he's got alpha 1, but has he got other stuff, the other genetic markers? And he's on the list to get selected for the tapestry study at Mayo. I'm really hopeful that if we can both get tested, that I can convince the study group to actually try and look at us together as a familial unit.
Mm.
and see if we can find out more.
Now talk about your symphony of hammer blows. You know, I mean, poor bastard.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. But I mean, he tries to maintain some perspective on all of it, even though it has it's reached a stage whereby it is kind of impacting his life way more than it did in his 20s and 30s.
Right.
He's just about to turn 39, so
And
yeah,
I grieve for you as a parent because, you're dealing with your own health challenges, and you've got this on your mind, probably outweighing your own at times. And because I know it would be the case for me with my kids, but
yeah.
you seem oddly full of equipoise given your situation, and I salute you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. You're not the first person to say that, and to be honest, Peter, I talk a lot about resilience, and you saw that I posted an article about another favorite Latin phrase of mine is invictus,
Mm.
undefeated. That's very much my attitude, and I think it's driven by the fact of, and this is how
You're
I
the guy that
felt.
got my wife to do this virtual Camino, who now has dragged me into doing the virtual. Thank you very much. Um, but I'm looking forward to it. And
No,
oddly enough, my sister-in-law is on the Camino, and I have her dog. So if you hear some barking in the background, he's a barker. Um,
no, that's awesome.
but
That's
but
awesome.
it's fascinating that the fact that we share this. We have such an interesting intersection of interests and
Mm,
avocation, and then we have this lung trajectory as well. And I mean, it's a very select club. What we
mm,
do with the time we've been given, um, I think everybody seems to have a different idea of what it means to them to be given these extra years. Some people don't
yeah.
do very much. I sometimes wonder, if I'll do justice to things as well, because I was talking to, there he goes. I was talking to Martha, my wife,
Mm,
about how, I was a clinical instructor up until, I don't know, 2023, 2022. And I loved working with medical students because they were kind of they were like a fountain of youth for me. Um,
mm,
and then my house burned down on Christmas Day that year, and I was diagnosed with IPF. So
mm,
first thing I did is I went into the Bible to refresh in my mind the story of Job, because I thought to myself, okay, where's my dunghill that I can sit on top of and get asked by the devil how happy I am with all this?
yeah.
Uh, and again, it was for me kind of an odd thing, because I went into retirement, and which I probably wouldn't have. And the post-retirement world for me, I don't know. I'm giving a lecture, believe it or not, to the medical group in my state on fibrosis
Mm,
in November. And I do like keeping my hand on things. I run a very interesting Facebook group with about 7,000 physicians, which I actually report on the literature on. Um,
mm,
and so I keep busy, but I find sometimes I even get drawn into those Facebook pulmonary fibrosis and lung transplant. And, it's mostly just trying to get them to understand, you know, really where they are. We talked about this before you hit the record button, how
mm,
much of it is fear, how much of it
mm,
is uncertainty about things. And really, it's kind of fear of the new. It's fear of the unknown,
mm,
which is actually one of the more interesting fears to have. Being fearful of something you don't even know that you're fearful of. I wonder about the logic of that, but that's probably a reptilian stress response on a certain level by people who haven't figured out intellectually how to cope with the consequences. But
mm.
at the basis of it, like somebody said on that group to me, uh, how long did it take you to decide that you were going to do a lung transplant? And I said 2.5 seconds after my local pulmonologist said that it was the only cure.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's what I'm looking for. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's probably, maybe a cure is a bit overstated, but at least while the time it's working, you are cured.
Yeah. David
Despite.
Erasmus, at the medical director at the Transplant Center in Vanderbilt, described it this way to me. He said, "We're going to take away a terminal disease and give you a chronic disease that we can maintain.
Brilliant.
And that will allow you to have a full and meaningful life. You will always have, an impacted disease, i.e. immunocompromised, and all the kind of impact of taking the drugs that manage that then take a toll on your body, et cetera, et cetera. But they've learned so much about it now that there's a reasonably good bet that, having dealt with this thing, because that's what the medical director of the ICU said to me when they broke the news to me, was lung transplant's your only option because the alternative is terminal. We can't sustain you on ECMO. We can't take you and turn you into, a cyborg robot version of Stuart by taking your lungs away. We have to transplant you. And so, therefore, that is the only option. Well, like you say, when you're faced with Hobson's choice, the answer is, sure, I'll take it.
Why not? Sign me up. What do I have to do?
Exactly.
How high?
Yeah.
The interesting thing about us and our generation, benefited from modern medicine, sort of. In other words, we got the amalgam fillings. Our kids got the sealant.
Yes.
But so they never have cavities. So we're always one level of technology. We have the breakthrough technology, but not the best technology. Yeah. Now you look at the lung transplant thing, and today I was reading an article about something called decellularization, recellularization. And this is going to be, in my estimation, how the kids who got their teeth sealed are going to get organs in the future, because what they do, and they've already proved this, they can take an organ from a cadaver or from another species and completely take the organ down to the extracellular matrix, the glue that holds the cells together, and then reconstitute it with germ cells from the recipient. No rejection, nothing. So again, this of course gets away from, is he dead? Is he not dead?
Yeah.
You can be completely dead and still do this. So, again, this is us with our lungs and our amalgams. And, this will be something else where we look at this world where
and that's it. I think I shared with you in a previous conversation my love of science fiction, big Star Trek and Star Wars, all genres, and I tend to typically consume more visually these days rather than reading. But I did read all the kind of classic kind of Asimov stuff. That's a hard work. It's hard work reading Asimov. I much prefer the movies. But Star Trek,
as a young man, I read a lot of Asimov. Yeah.
I mean, we are gluttons for punishment in that way.
Believe it or not, I came at Asimov from a perspective of my work in blood type, because I wrote a book with an immunologist named William Boyd, who was the person who discovered that there were natural agglutins in the diet that react with your blood group antigens. So Boyd and Asimov wrote a book in the 1950s that was the first defense against the use of race to make any generalizations about aptitude, abilities, or whatever. And at that point, I kind of had a warm spot for Asimov, because it felt like, okay, this guy was a straight shooter.
The point I was going to make was in relation to Star Trek 4, the movie. And there is a scene where they are trying to break into a hospital to rescue one of their colleagues who has been injured whilst trying to steal nuclear material. It's very complicated. But Dr. McCoy in there's this woman in the corridor on a gurney who clearly is dying. And they're she's being ignored. A classic kind of corridor emergency room case. And as he's walking by, he whips out his scanner and goes, "This is ridiculous." And he turns to, there's a doctor walking by. He says, "What are you doing for this woman?" And the doctor sort of like spouts off something. I can't remember what it was. And he went, "My God, man, that's barbaric." And I think that's the thing, that as we look back at medical history, and you look back at the 19th century, and some of the things that our predecessors in healthcare were doing to treat conditions as they discovered it, and we go, "Oh my goodness!" That like you go to the Lister Museum or any of these kind of
Right.
medical museums, and you look at the practices and the instruments, and you go, "Holy moly, those are instruments of torture," and it's not. That was state of the art then. And so I think you're correct. Is as we go forward, there will be people who look back at now and go, "You people were so stupid and
I know.
basic," and
How,
yeah,
how, how
yeah.
did you how did you think that putting an organ from somebody else was the solution to the issue? Well, that's all we could think of at the time, unfortunately.
Exactly.
There was an interesting
I,
TV show called The
yeah.
Nick, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you ever saw that. It was
Yes, I
about a
did.
hospital
Yeah.
at the 1900s where, they had to do a uterine removal with a stopwatch because they hadn't figured out blood typing and also. And
Yeah.
it was a good show until it kind of went off the rails at the end there. But
Yeah, they got kind of lost in the surgeon's drug addiction aspect of
yeah, it
things, and
was
that
like,
got very dark.
and then all of a sudden one of the black physicians is a prize fighter. And it's like, what's
Yeah,
going on here? But anyway,
yeah,
I thought it was, that first couple of episodes I thought were just so cool. And again, you realize that talk, we've really never had a leap in our knowledge to really equal that time period because
mm,
the achievements were so easy to get. Germ theory, basic
mm,
immunology, basic blood grouping. Now everything we've done all the easy stuff, unfortunately,
yeah,
and now we're left with, little tiny baby steps here and there. And I mean, it's amazing to see what, we're capable of with regard to, our business information. I mean,
mm,
I love how, you can read a medical article now, and usually at the bottom of it is the Excel spreadsheets with all the data. So if you want to
yep,
go through them, here it is. And how, I've always loved how if I needed something from an author, you write them a nice letter. And I was writing a piece of software that was looking at how to change the microbiome by playing one species against another with certain foods and things.
mm-hmm,
And the guy in Norway had produced a set of data on which bacteria tended to inhibit or encourage the other bacteria. So it was a relationship thing. And I wanted to get it. So I wrote him a letter and, this is what I want to do. And if you would be so nice, writes me a beautiful letter back. He goes, yeah. And I did all the regressions for you while I was at it because I wanted to get it all cleaned up for you. And it's like, this is a wonderful world we live in,